I come from a clinical background as a child psychiatrist. I thought I'd be prepared for virtually any eventuality with her aging needs. It was really a crisis in my life when I realized that I was seriously mistaken. My name is George Hallas. I care for my mum, and her medical diagnosis of relevance here started about 10 years ago with spinal stenosis, which means a narrowing of her spine, and that resulted in increased disability in mobilizing and walking. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to care for my mother as her deterioration progressed and her dependency needs increased, and being her only son, I was the provider of much of that needed dependency for the care that she needed. Some of the nuances and details for people who don't know what caring for someone with a mobility disability centers around the relinquishing involuntarily, not that they want to. They're forced to relinquish one of the great signs of independence, which is mobility. But here it was the degree of independent mobility. And that, of course, leads on to, in my mother's case, many other issues that eventually culminated in her not being able to drive. And so these dependency needs, which were never apparent while she was mobile, literally on her feet or in a car, came to the fore. And as they came to the fore, the dependency of, for me as the carer, become greater to provide compensation, if you like, to make up for the things that she lacked or was weaning off or suddenly had to change. The things that I wish I would have noticed before I reached my crisis point was a better understanding of my own inability to care. And I didn't really register, as the demands on my care were increasing, that I was not actually meeting them, or put it another way, I was meeting them for my mother's needs at my expense. And to meet the needs of my mother's care, and to be sustainable in meeting that, I had to turn around and find out that I had to attend to my needs in order to provide the needs that she needed. I think, being a male, I found two issues that were the biggest barriers for me to seek help. One is that very thing, seeking help rather than self-reliance. And secondly, admitting to myself that I was vulnerable, that I'd run out of oomph, I'd run out of skill sets. And those two were my probably biggest barriers. I come from a clinical background as a child psychiatrist, so I thought, silly me, I thought I'd be prepared for virtually any eventuality with her aging needs. It was really a crisis in my life when I realized that I was seriously mistaken, that all my previous experiences, training, exposure, which I had considerable exposure and training in care, was surprisingly inaccessible. I was not able to tap into that experience when it came to mobilizing myself for my mother's care. So I was actually in quite a state of crisis and shock. It was one day I thought I was caring enough, and the next day I realized I couldn't do any more. And there was nothing in between. So that's what I mean by crisis. And that's when I realized my professional thinking kicked in, that I knew in a medical crisis you call someone who's an expert. At least I knew that much, or I had retained that much through the crisis, and that's how it all started. I first heard about Alfred Carer's services from a couple of professionals who I was consulting for personal support with my own dealing with the crises that I was in. This was during COVID, mind you. And when I realized that there'd be an expert in the field who could inform me of what I hoped I'd be told or taught what I lacked. So I was very motivated, but I didn't know in what direction and who it would be. And Alfred Carer's was given to me by one of the carers, one of the professionals I sought counselling from. I was actually introduced to Carer's Gateway first, and then had a number of phone calls and indeed some very valuable support. And it was the end of that phase of support that I was made aware that there's such a thing as carers coaching, which I'd never even heard of. The reason that I sought Alfred Carer's coaching is because I found that my family, my friends, professional colleagues, peers, virtually anyone who I spoke with didn't quite get it. And that's a terrible feeling with people you're close and intimate with, to get the idea that they're not getting you. And I couldn't figure out why. But I definitely felt this gulf, this gap between how they responded with empathy, with sympathy, with support, with care, with all those things that reasonable people hopefully can offer, and I did receive. And so I was left a bit adrift. Why am I still feeling not met in my needs? And that troubled me enormously, this gap. And that's where I turned to Alfred Care. My first session with my coach was amazing. And the first impression was clearly her voice, and the coach's voice was sympathetic. But more than that, she offered a way of listening, and then later the very practical, on-the-spot advice, again and again and again. It wasn't just a potluck. It was repeated, brilliant advice, meeting where I was, where I didn't know I was. The coaching sessions went on for a number of months over the phone. It was during the COVID period. So there was plenty of time to consolidate a great deal of wisdom in the coaching I received, and in between to apply it. I mean, this was not a lecture, this was a relationship, how to use coaching. And so I took the advice, the wisdom, applied it first in my reflections and then in my relationship with my mum, and then went back to the next session where there'd be a brief review of how it went, which was very important. That there was a continuity where I didn't even realize there should be. I was so fragmented in my caring approach that the coaching provided the links between the dots. And then as the coaching sessions deepened in detail, I could make use of it in more and more specific examples and prevent myself from going chaotic. And that's where things became so consolidated that it felt time to think of winding down. The way I started to think and see how the coaching that I was receiving differed from what I was offering in my clinical practice was literally a coach is involved in the here and now, taking account of the past, but coming out with very practical recommendations from an understanding, not taken off a shelf as a preconceived idea, but out of the understanding of the relationship. Now, from my experience of what I received in coaching as a carer, what I wish other people would learn about the needs of carers is sometimes they need to be listened to in a very special way, not with a ready answer, because the best well-wished answer is not necessarily what a carer needs. A carer needs the space to be understood, because my experience is I didn't even understand what I needed. So that's a big ask, I think, from any general public person, even immediate family, or perhaps especially immediate family. But that's what I learned from the coaching, that space to enter into being heard from a place that the carer doesn't even yet know needs to be understood. And that would be the lesson I learned, which I hope others might be able to take on board outside of the caring profession. Just human to human, learning to understand there's more than question and answer. I'm usually not in the position to offer advice to others. It's not my style. But learning from this experience of myself as a son, a male carer for my mother's needs, perhaps I might venture a bit of advice to fellow males. And I know this is a gender-sensitive topic, so I use it only specifically in my role. But I think if we can overcome, as males, the barrier to admit our vulnerability. It is not a failing to be vulnerable. It is not a deficiency to be vulnerable. It's not a negativity to be vulnerable. It is being a bigger human being. And why not try to be a bigger human being, male or female? Before we conclude, what I'd love to share is gratitude. Gratitude to my coach, gratitude to her team and to the Alfred Carer Service, whoever established it and whoever's funding it, and wish that more people could avail themselves to know that there is a possibility to reach out and there's someone at the other end who you don't even know will enhance your humanity.